We understand today that there is a difference between bourbon and whiskey. We don't always know what it is, but we understand culturally that there is a distinction. In the time period of the 18th century, whiskey was whiskey, and it didn't look like this. It looked like this. I lived in Kentucky for 10 years of my life. Now I'm not a native to Kentucky, and if you are from Kentucky or generally from the South, you can smell that on me. I'm not from down there. Lived up here in Indiana when I was younger, and I moved down to Kentucky, and as soon as I did, I hear this word bourbon. Bourbon, bourbon, bourbon everywhere. And there are a lot of really strong feelings about bourbon versus what people call Tennessee whiskey. Down in Kentucky, it is not uncommon to walk into a household, say you're going over to a friend's house, and somebody proudly says, not all whiskey is bourbon, but all bourbon is whiskey. And what they're doing there is they're making a clear distinction that there's something special about their Kentucky bourbon. They want people to know this is bourbon. In fact, you'll even hear that for a bourbon to be a bourbon, it has to be made in Kentucky, which is not true and it never has been, but that is part of their heritage. They're proud of that. You will hear people say that the reason that bourbon is special and needs to be made in Kentucky is because of all the limestone that the water is filtered through in Kentucky, and because the climate in Kentucky is perfect for storing all throughout the year bourbon in barrels in these big barns that hold it at distilleries. And if you go into one of those barns and you smell it and you take it all in, it is a sight to behold, and it is wonderful for the senses. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, even though I am not a Kentucky native, I was drawn into this. I love bourbon. And I'll tell you, to this day, even if I go into a grocery store or a liquor store and I'm looking for a bottle of bourbon, if it is not distilled in Kentucky, I will not buy it. And that might seem silly to a lot of people, but that is something that is special to me, and it's probably because of my time living in that state. The reality is that until I started researching bourbon for historical context, I didn't even realize that it wasn't even regulated until 1964, which blew my mind. And what it means to be bourbon is it has to be a 51% at least corn mash bill, and it has to be made in the United States territories, which was almost disappointing to find that out, because I believed, man, this has to be made in Kentucky. The late 18th century is where I've been focusing most of my research, and at that time, whiskey is not top dog as far as alcohols are concerned. People are really liking brandy, then comes rum, then comes whiskey. And that's because things like brandy taste like what's coming from France, and rum has been used for a long time. That's very strong as far as the British are concerned, and it's being imported like crazy. Whiskey is being made here, made out of necessity. Farmers are distilling whiskey because they don't want their crops to go bad. If you're a farmer at this time in history, your fields are plentiful. The grains are going crazy because this ground is so fertile, especially corn. As you're harvesting your corn, you need a way to not have waste. You can't store that corn forever and it just not go bad. You can turn it into alcohol. You can bottle it up and you can store that for a long time, and along the way, you can turn that into money by selling it. You can use it as a currency by bartering and trading. It turns into part of your household budget, and it stores forever without spoiling. So we're not only talking about corn. You can distill pretty much any grain into an alcohol. And if you look through historical cookbooks, they're going to go through grain after grain after grain. There's buckwheat whiskey, there's all kinds of whiskey. But it's a way for farmers to be able to pull from harvest and not have anything ruined. Another rule that people know and recognize about bourbon is that it needs to be stored in charred white oak barrels. That wasn't happening in the time period. These farmers were doing most of the distilling. There weren't a lot of huge operations, and they weren't making enough to fill up a barrel. They're storing it in jugs. And a lot of the color that we see from bourbon nowadays, that's coming from that charred white oak barrel. That's one of the reasons that we don't have that. Now, they weren't even storing it for super long because they're turning that into income. And so when it comes out white and it's lean and it's young, they're storing back what they need for themselves. They're using the rest to turn into currency because their household still has to move, and they still have to make money out of those crops, even though it's not being sold as corn. So where does the name bourbon come from? And we're so stuck on this name now, but in the time period, they weren't. There were lots of distilling operations throughout the West, right? So Virginia is distilling a lot. So is Kentucky. You see it a little bit in Indiana, but mainly Pennsylvania and up in Maryland. There's distillation happening in all of those places. And whiskey, it's on the come up. It's starting to catch on. A lot of people still aren't sure how much they like it, but it's happening. And like I said, it's happening so that crops don't go bad. So bourbon itself, there's a lot of folklore. There's a lot of assumptions as to where the name comes from. And there are a lot of claims that this is the true one, this is the right one. But really, I'm not sure. And I don't think anybody is actually really sure where the name bourbon comes from. What is known now as Bourbon County, Kentucky was actually part of Virginia in the time period. In 1785, they started to split up some counties. It eventually becomes part of the state of Kentucky. Popular folklore says that the bourbon or the whiskey that was being taken out and exported from Bourbon County, Kentucky was marked with the word bourbon, and that's where the name comes from. Other people say that it was a rich whiskey culture down in New Orleans, and that's where the name comes from. Some people say that Elijah Craig was the first person to make bourbon whiskey. Now, there was a lot of whiskey being made around him. What do you guys think? What have you heard about bourbon? What's the true story? Let me know in the comment section. So let's imagine for a moment that we're in the late 18th century and you're traveling. You come across a public house, you're gonna stay at the tavern, and you walk in and you want some whiskey. This is gonna be what the proprietor pushes towards you. This is the whiskey. Let's take a taste and see what it's like, because it's not anything like what we're used to. It's not bad, but it's not great. It's not aged. It's not treated over time. When we taste a white whiskey like this now, it can leave a little bit to be desired. We're used to bourbons that have been aged in these white oak barrels for several years, and they're more rounded. They're not so lean and mean, but it's still good. It's fine. What was really popular in the time period was to make a brandy or a rum punch, and you start to see whiskey coming in as the alcohol in those punches. So we're gonna make a punch right now. For that, we're gonna need about 4 ounces of sugar, 12 ounces of water. Then we're gonna use 6 ounces of the white whiskey with 6 ounces of citrus juice, maybe a little bit of zest and a sprinkle of nutmeg. Super simple, you can do it at home and it's gonna taste fabulous. Our whiskey punch is finished. It looks great. It smells really good. It smells like a complex lemonade because it's got all these different citrus fruits in it. It's very sweet. You can smell the whiskey just a little bit. We'll see how much of it you can taste here in a minute. First, I want to thank Brian Cushing from the Victorian Barroom channel. Thank you so much for your help in making this episode. It was really wonderful to be able to take my research and run it past somebody who's been researching this forever, and he is just a wealth of information. All right, let's see what's going on here. Ooh, yeah, that's really good. That's really good. The whiskey's there. You can't smell it, but you can taste it, but not overpowering. It's just right there in the middle. Okay, what do I think after all that research? In the time period, whiskey was a whiskey. They're making it from different grains, but whiskey's whiskey. Now, all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon.